In the rolling hills of Virginia's horse country, where colonial mansions stand testament to centuries of accumulated wealth and social privilege, there existed in the year 1895 a family whose name had once commanded respect throughout the Commonwealth, but whose fortunes had been steadily declining for more than a generation. The Ashfords of Ravens Hollow had built their reputation on tobacco plantations and shipping ventures that had made them among the wealthiest families in the antebellum South, but the economic upheavals that followed the Civil War had systematically destroyed the foundations of their prosperity, leaving them with little more than faded gentility and mounting debts that threatened to consume what remained of their ancestral legacy. Marcus Ashford, the last male heir of the family line, found himself in 1895 facing the prospect of losing everything that generations of his ancestors had built. At 38 years old, he possessed neither the business acumen nor the capital necessary to restore his family's fortune through conventional means, while his education as a gentleman had left him unprepared for the kinds of practical endeavors that might have provided modest but honest income. His wife Catherine and their two young children, Thomas and Margaret, lived in genteel poverty within the walls of Ashford Manor, maintaining appearances through careful economy, while watching their world slowly crumble around them. The transformation that would elevate the Ashford family from near bankruptcy to unprecedented wealth began on a foggy October evening, when Marcus encountered a stranger on the road that led from the village to his estate. The man, who gave his name only as Mr. Blackwood, appeared to be a fellow gentleman fallen on hard times, though his clothing and manner suggested education and refinement that seemed inconsistent with his claim to be seeking employment as a tutor or estate manager. The conversation that followed, as Marcus would later record in his private journal, began as a chance meeting between two men discussing the economic challenges that had affected so many Virginia families in the decades following Reconstruction. But as they walked together toward Ashford Manor, Blackwood's questions became increasingly personal and specific, revealing knowledge of the family's financial situation that no casual acquaintance should have possessed. He spoke of our debts with precision that suggested access to private banking records. Marcus wrote in his journal entry for October 15, 1895. He knew the exact amounts we owed, the dates when payments were due, and even the contents of correspondence that I had received from creditors. When I asked how he had acquired such information, he smiled and suggested that a man in his position made it his business to understand the circumstances of families who might benefit from his assistance. The assistance that Blackwood offered was presented not as charity or conventional investment, but as a business proposition that would guarantee the restoration of Ashford prosperity in exchange for considerations that he described as services and commitments that go beyond simple financial obligation. The specifics of the arrangement were to be negotiated in private, away from the curious eyes of servants and family members who might not understand the sophisticated nature of the agreement being proposed. The meeting that sealed the Ashford family's fate took place 3 nights later in the library of Ashford Manor, with only Marcus and Blackwood present to witness the signing of documents that would transform the family's circumstances in ways that exceeded their most optimistic expectations. The contract that Marcus signed was written in language that combined legal terminology with phrases that seemed to draw upon older traditions of binding agreement, creating obligations that were both specific and strangely ambiguous. According to the terms that Marcus recorded in coded entries throughout his journal, the Ashford family would receive unlimited financial resources to restore their estate and establish new business ventures, along with guarantees of success in any undertaking they chose to pursue. In exchange, they would provide Blackwood with what he termed exclusive access to the spiritual essence and generational continuity of the family line, along with commitments to maintain certain practices and observances that would ensure the ongoing vitality of their agreement. The fulfillment of Blackwood's promises began immediately and proceeded with efficiency that defied every principle of normal business development. Within weeks of signing the contract, Marcus received notification that debts that had threatened his family for years had been mysteriously satisfied by anonymous benefactors, while new investment opportunities appeared that offered guaranteed returns far exceeding anything available through conventional channels. The tobacco venture that Marcus established in partnership with investors whom Blackwood introduced generated profits that made the family wealthy beyond their previous dreams within a single growing season. The shipping company that followed proved equally successful, while real estate investments in Richmond and Norfolk provided steady income that supported a lifestyle of unprecedented luxury and social prominence. But the success that the family enjoyed came with obligations that became apparent only gradually, as Blackwood's periodic visits to Ashford Manor revealed the true nature of the services that their contract required. The practices that he introduced were presented as family traditions that had been temporarily abandoned, but which needed to be restored to maintain the spiritual foundations that supported their material prosperity. The rituals that became part of the Ashford family's routine were conducted in the privacy of their estate, away from the observation of neighbors or servants who might not understand their significance. These ceremonies, which Blackwood claimed drew upon ancient knowledge of the relationships between spiritual forces and material success, involved procedures that combined elements of various occult traditions with requirements that seemed designed to bind the family ever more tightly to their supernatural benefactor. Catherine Ashford's private diary, discovered years later hidden behind a false panel in her bedroom, provides the most detailed account of how these practices affected the family's daily life and psychological well-being. Her entries reveal a woman who was initially grateful for their restored prosperity, but who gradually became aware that the price they were paying extended far beyond simple financial obligation. Marcus insists that the ceremonies are merely expressions of gratitude for our good fortune, she wrote in January 1896, but the words we are required to speak and the actions we must perform feel more like worship than thanksgiving. Mr. Blackwood speaks of our family as if we belong to him rather than to ourselves, and I fear that we have entered into agreements that we do not fully understand. The children, Thomas and Margaret, were gradually introduced to the family's new practices as they grew old enough to participate in what their parents described as important family traditions. The psychological impact of these experiences on young minds was documented in Catherine's increasingly frantic diary entries, which described behavioral changes in her children that suggested exposure to influences that were fundamentally altering their development. Thomas speaks of dreams that seem more real to him than his waking life, Catherine recorded in March 1896. He describes conversations with Mr. Blackwood that occurred during his sleep, sessions where he receives instruction about his future role in maintaining our family's prosperity. Margaret has begun to display knowledge about subjects that she has never studied, speaking with authority about matters that no 7-year-old child should comprehend. As we delve into this chilling tale of supernatural commerce and the prices paid for material success, we must confront the possibility that some forms of wealth come with obligations that extend far beyond financial repayment. The story we're exploring forces us to question whether prosperity achieved through supernatural means might cost more than any family should be willing to pay, and what happens when the price of success includes the very souls of those who seek it. If you find yourself drawn to these investigations into the dark side of ambition and the terrible bargains that some make in pursuit of wealth, please share your thoughts in the comments below and join our community by subscribing to the channel. The expansion of the Ashford family's wealth and influence throughout the late 1890s proceeded at a pace that amazed their social circle while creating unease among competitors who could not understand the source of their unprecedented success. Every business venture they entered prospered beyond reasonable expectation, while their investments yielded returns that seemed to defy economic logic and market principles. The restoration of Ashford Manor was completed with resources that appeared unlimited, transforming the decaying mansion into a showplace that rivaled the finest estates in Virginia. The grounds were expanded and landscaped according to designs that combined traditional English garden principles with elements that seemed to draw upon much older traditions of symbolic arrangement and spiritual significance. But the physical transformation of their property was accompanied by changes in the family members themselves that became apparent to visitors who had known them before their sudden rise to prominence. Marcus displayed a confidence and business acumen that seemed inconsistent with his previous character, making decisions with authority that suggested knowledge and experience far beyond his actual background. Catherine's transformation was even more dramatic, as she evolved from a woman struggling with genteel poverty into a society hostess whose intelligence and sophistication attracted attention from prominent families throughout the region. But her social success was accompanied by a hardness and calculating quality that replaced the warmth and spontaneity that had characterized her personality before their arrangement with Blackwood. The children's development followed patterns that disturbed the tutors and governesses who were employed to provide their education. Thomas and Margaret displayed intellectual capabilities that exceeded what should have been possible for their ages, while their emotional responses and social interactions suggested maturity that seemed unnatural in such young people. Dr. William Morrison, the family physician who had known the Ashfords for many years, documented changes in all family members that challenged his understanding of normal human development and psychology. His private notes describe individuals who retained their physical appearance and basic personality traits, but who seemed to have acquired additional layers of knowledge and capability that had not been present previously. The family appears to have been enhanced rather than simply enriched by their change in circumstances, Dr. Morrison wrote in his confidential medical journal. Their physical health is excellent, their intellectual capabilities are remarkable, and their social skills are highly developed. Yet there is something about their manner and behavior that suggests they are not entirely the same people I knew before their rise to prosperity. The doctor's observations were supported by reports from domestic staff who noted that the family's daily routines had been modified to include private activities that were conducted behind locked doors in rooms that servants were forbidden to enter. The sounds that emerged from these sessions were described as combinations of chanting, conversation, and other activities that suggested the presence of additional individuals, despite the fact that no visitors had been seen entering or leaving the manor. More disturbing were the changes in the family's relationships with each other, as the natural affection and concern that had bound them together during their period of financial hardship was gradually replaced by interactions that seemed more formal and purposeful. Catherine's diary entries from this period describe a household where love had been transformed into something that resembled business partnership, with each family member playing roles that served the collective interests of their supernatural arrangement. "We no longer speak to each other as husband and wife or parents and children," she wrote in September 1897. "Our conversations focus on maintaining the practices that ensure our continued prosperity, while our affections have been redirected towards serving the entity that has provided our success. I fear that we are becoming instruments of his will rather than beneficiaries of his generosity." The true nature of their supernatural benefactor became clearer as Blackwood's visits to Ashford Manor became more frequent and his demands for family participation in his activities became more extensive. The man who had initially appeared as a helpful business associate gradually revealed himself to be something far more sinister, an entity whose interest in the Ashford family extended beyond simple financial partnership into territory that challenged every assumption about the nature of human relationships and spiritual obligation. Catherine's diary provides the most detailed account of Blackwood's transformation from mysterious benefactor into obvious supernatural predator. Her entries describe a being whose appearance shifted depending on lighting and perspective, whose knowledge encompassed information that no normal human could possess, and whose presence in their home created atmospheric conditions that affected both temperature and the behavior of animals throughout the estate. He speaks of our contract as if it extends beyond our individual lifetimes to encompass future generations of our family, Catherine wrote in her increasingly desperate entries. Our children are not simply beneficiaries of the wealth he has provided, but collateral for obligations that will continue long after Marcus and I are dead. We have not sold our souls. We have mortgaged the souls of our descendants for prosperity that will ultimately serve his purposes rather than our own. The realization that their agreement with Blackwood included provisions that would bind their children and their children's children to serve his agenda created a crisis within the family that threatened to destroy the unity that had enabled their success. Marcus's journal entries from late 1897 reveal a man torn between gratitude for the prosperity that had rescued his family from ruin and growing awareness that the price they were paying would ultimately exceed any benefits they had received. Catherine speaks of breaking our contract and returning to poverty rather than condemning our children to lives of spiritual servitude, Marcus wrote. But Blackwood has made clear that our agreement cannot be terminated unilaterally and that attempts to escape our obligations would result in consequences far worse than simple loss of wealth. The specific nature of these consequences was demonstrated when Catherine attempted to resist participating in a ceremony that Blackwood claimed was necessary for maintaining their family's prosperity. Her refusal to comply with his instructions was followed by a series of incidents that seemed designed to demonstrate the extent of his power over their lives and the futility of resistance to his will. The first manifestation of Blackwood's displeasure was the sudden illness that struck both children simultaneously, a malady that no physician could diagnose or treat, but which appeared to be directly related to their mother's defiance. Thomas and Margaret developed symptoms that resembled consumption, but progressed far more rapidly than any natural disease, while their consciousness remained clear enough for them to plead with their parents to do whatever was necessary to restore their health. Dr. Morrison's examination of the children revealed physical evidence that their condition was not caused by any known pathogen or toxin, but rather by what he could only describe as systematic withdrawal of vital energy that appears to be controlled by external forces. The children were literally wasting away despite receiving the best medical care available, dying not from disease, but from deliberate withholding of the spiritual sustenance that had been maintaining their enhanced vitality. Catherine's capitulation to Blackwood's demands was immediate and complete, as she realized that resistance would cost her children their lives while accomplishing nothing to free her family from their supernatural bondage. Her participation in the ceremony that she had previously refused marked the beginning of the final phase of the family's transformation from human beings into instruments of their benefactor's will. The ritual that Catherine was compelled to perform involved the formal surrender of her family's autonomy and the acknowledgement that their prosperity had transformed them into property of the entity that had provided it. The ceremony, conducted in the presence of her husband and children, included vows that bound all family members to serve Blackwood's purposes without question or resistance for as long as their bloodline continued to exist. The immediate result of this surrender was the restoration of the children's health and the family's return to the unprecedented prosperity they had enjoyed before Catherine's attempted rebellion. But the psychological cost of their capitulation was documented in diary entries that reveal individuals who had lost not only their independence, but their capacity for authentic human emotion and relationships. "We are no longer a family in any meaningful sense," Catherine wrote in her final diary entry. "We are components of a system that serves purposes we cannot understand, playing roles that have been assigned to us by an intelligence that views us as useful tools rather than beloved creatures worthy of consideration and care." The decline of the Ashford family began in 1899, when Blackwood announced that the first phase of their agreement had been completed successfully and that new obligations would require different services that would test their commitment to their supernatural partnership. The children, now approaching adolescence, would be required to participate more directly in activities that would prepare them for adult roles in maintaining their family's arrangement. The nature of these new requirements was never fully documented, but Catherine's behavior during her final months suggested exposure to experiences that challenged her sanity and her capacity for normal human interaction. She became increasingly withdrawn and erratic, speaking of obligations that extended beyond death and responsibilities that would require sacrifices that no mother should be asked to make. The tragedy that would ultimately destroy the Ashford family occurred on Christmas Eve of 1899, when Catherine was found dead in the library where the original contract had been signed 4 years earlier. The circumstances of her death defied medical explanation, as she showed no signs of injury or illness but had apparently died from what Dr. Morrison could only describe as complete spiritual exhaustion. Marcus's reaction to his wife's death revealed the extent to which the family's supernatural arrangement had corrupted his capacity for normal grief and human emotion. Rather than mourning Catherine's loss, he seemed primarily concerned with ensuring that her death would not interfere with their ongoing obligations to Blackwood, while treating his children's distress as inconvenient obstacles to maintaining their contractual commitments. The final collapse came within months of Catherine's death, as the children began to display symptoms that suggested they were following their mother's path toward spiritual dissolution. Thomas and Margaret, despite their youth, had been so thoroughly integrated into their family's supernatural arrangement that they could not survive without the constant reinforcement that their mother's participation had provided. Their deaths, when they occurred in rapid succession during the spring of 1900, were attributed to the same unexplained exhaustion that had claimed Catherine, though witnesses reported phenomena surrounding their passing that suggested their spiritual essence had been harvested rather than simply released through natural death. Marcus himself survived for another year, but his existence during this period resembled that of an automaton rather than a grieving father and widower. He continued to maintain the practices that his contract required, while managing the business interests that had made his family wealthy, but his behavior suggested that his consciousness had been reduced to the minimum level necessary to fulfill his obligations. His death in 1901 marked the official end of the Ashford family line, though the circumstances surrounding his passing suggested that his spiritual essence had joined those of his wife and children in serving purposes that extended beyond normal human existence. The wealth that had been accumulated through their supernatural partnership was dispersed according to provisions that had been written into documents whose authorship could not be determined. Ashford Manor was acquired by interests that could not be traced to any legitimate business entity, while the family's other assets disappeared into financial structures that seemed designed to conceal their ultimate ownership. The estate itself was closed to public access and began to deteriorate rapidly, as if the supernatural forces that had maintained its perfection had been withdrawn following the completion of whatever project had required the Ashford family's participation. As our investigation concludes with this devastating tale of ambition transformed into spiritual slavery, we must reflect on the true costs of wealth achieved through supernatural means and the dangers of making bargains that promise more than mortal means should be able to provide. If these revelations about the prices paid for prosperity compel you to question the sources of success and the wisdom of seeking wealth through any means necessary, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more explorations into the dark side of human ambition. The long-term consequences of the Ashford family's pact extended far beyond their individual destruction to influence the social and economic life of their region for generations. The supernatural wealth that had been channeled through their enterprises created disruptions in local markets and business relationships that took decades to resolve, while the methods they had employed to achieve success inspired imitators whose own attempts at supernatural commerce often ended in tragedy. The academic study of the case was limited by the destruction of most family records and the reluctance of surviving associates to discuss their knowledge of the Ashfords' business practices. But the documented pattern of rapid wealth accumulation, followed by equally rapid family dissolution, provided insights into the psychology of individuals who became willing to sacrifice fundamental human values in pursuit of material success. The theological implications of the case influenced religious discussions about the nature of spiritual commerce and the dangers of seeking material prosperity through supernatural means. Several denominations incorporated warnings about the Ashford tragedy into their teachings about the proper relationship between worldly success and spiritual health. The site of Ashford Manor remains uninhabited to this day, though it continues to attract interest from researchers who study supernatural phenomena and the lingering effects of occult practices. Local residents report unusual experiences associated with the abandoned estate, including sounds that suggest ongoing activity within the ruined buildings and lights that appear in windows of structures that have been empty for more than a century. The mystery of what became of the Ashford family's spiritual essence remains unresolved, though some researchers suggest that their consciousness may continue to exist in forms that serve their supernatural benefactors' ongoing projects. The possibility that their souls remain bound to Blackwood's service raises disturbing questions about the permanence of contracts that involve spiritual rather than material obligations. The Macabre Pact that promised the Ashford family wealth and success delivered exactly what was promised, but the price they paid, their autonomy, their humanity, and ultimately their very existence, revealed that some forms of prosperity are too expensive for any rational person to afford. Their story serves as a warning about the dangers of seeking success through supernatural means, and the importance of understanding that true wealth cannot be separated from the values and relationships that give life meaning. In the end, perhaps the most tragic aspect of their story is not what they lost, but what they gained, a prosperity that corrupted everything they touched and transformed their love for each other into instruments of their own destruction. The family who sold their souls for wealth discovered that the price of supernatural success was not just their individual lives, but their capacity to remain human beings worthy of love, compassion, and salvation. The empty rooms of Ashford Manor stand as a monument to the futility of pursuing material success at the cost of spiritual integrity, while their story continues to serve as a warning that some bargains are too terrible to make, regardless of the benefits they might seem to offer. The wealth they achieved through their pact with darkness brought them everything they thought they wanted, and cost them everything that truly mattered, leaving behind only ruins and regrets as testimony to the prices that some are willing to pay for prosperity that ultimately serves purposes other than their own.